Radio Cairo, FM 95.4. The Voice of Egypt.
Radio Cairo, it's 4 o'clock and this is time for World of Info. This is World of Info coming live from Studio 3. Our line number is 257-89407. My name is Dr. Mabrouk, and really we are very proud to have with us today the one and only Mr. Mohamed Salmawy, a distinguished writer, a distinguished journalist, and a distinguished opinion leader, and definitely a man of a great substance and stamina. And maybe 6 months or less than 1 year ago, he has published his first part of his memoirs, a book that has attracted the attention of a lot of our listeners and our readers, and everybody was so fascinated and impressed, of course, with the very interesting times and life of Mr. Mohamed Salmawy, but also with the ideas, the thoughts that he shared with his readers, and the beautiful language that he has written it. And of course, most of all is the number of pictures. Most of them have been photographed by him during different periods of his life, almost 150 photographs in the book. And today we are going to discuss the book, but definitely we're going to discuss also the life and the times of Mr. Mohamed Salmawy. Sir, thank you very much for coming and honoring us with your visit to our program. And I know that this is part of your home because you have been a member of the European Local Service in the, shall we say, the time, in the 60s?
It's a pleasure to be here, to meet you and to meet your all your listeners.
Really, it's a great pleasure and honor. I mean, the idea of writing a book or memoirs is always very critical for a human being. Once one of the Naguib Mahfouz, the famous Nobel laureate, who of course has a very strong tie with you, and we're going to discuss that later, he said that anyone who can, even if he is coming from a very bad background, if he writes his true story, definitely his novel is going to be very interesting, and it's going to be interesting for the people to read. But Mr. Mohamed Salmawy has written a very interesting book, and without hurting the feelings of anyone. Although he has met, of course, people who deserved his confidence and his friendship, and others who failed this trust, and yet he was so careful and cautious in touching the lives and the times of different people and incidents he met without hurting anyone. And I believe this is a great success. So, sir, I will stop talking and will start asking you about the lives and the time of Mr. Mohamed Salmawy.
Okay, shoot.
Well, of course, when you write the book, you went to the roots and you have discussed the life of your grandparents. I mean, the first grandparent is from your father's side, and the name Salmawy is that he's coming from Arabia. And you were very stunned when he insisted, your grandfather from the paternal side, Salmawy, that he told you you should use the G, not the Gim, because we are coming from the Arab Peninsula. And you were doubting that very much until you did the genetic test and you found out that you are pure Arab, having more Arab genes than African genes. Tell us about this in particular and how this affected you, the idea of having a grandfather who's so proud of the roots.
I think he was trying to sort of tell us where we came from and who we were. And he had a family tree which was lost over the years. But I remember we were very young when he showed us the family tree, and he said that our great seventh grandfather or so came during the Arab conquest of Egypt, and he came from a tribe, an Arab tribe in the Arabian Peninsula, known as the Salma tribe. It was named after a mountain in the peninsula called Salma.
It's more southern towards Yemen, right? More or less?
I think so, yes. I've never been to the mountain. But, and hence his name became, when he settled in Egypt, became Salmawy, meaning the one from Salma. And I was curious when I heard about the DNA tests and all that, and the genetic pools. I was very curious. I didn't doubt my grandfather's story, of course, but I was curious to know how much was left of this Arab blood after 7 or 8 generations. So
how much was it diluted?
Yes, and of course there were a lot of intermarriages over the years, and was the percentage of Arab blood still a large one or not? And it turned out to be the biggest percentage of any genetic pool turned out to be still the Arab.
So the family maintained the purity of the Arab blood. That's very good.
Well, purity is a dangerous word to use
Course,
now
course.
after the Second World War.
Yes, yes, and this is what I really wanted to emphasize, because the other grandfather was also a very interesting person. I mean, from the maternal side, Shitabi was a totally independent and a man who was a pioneer in business, who started from scratch and yet was able to build a semi-empire built completely on trust and confidence and honesty. And he led a very decent life in business. So tell us about Shitabi, and I think you had met him, right? And
well,
you had an encounter with him.
He died when I was 1 year old.
Oh, yes.
But of course, a lot of his stories remained in the family, and a lot of pictures of me with him, and a lot of pictures of a car he bought me. He bought me a car when I was only 1 year old.
As the first grandchild, I mean, for both
as the
sides.
First grandchild, and as a way of making sure that my parents would send me to him. He sent them a car with a chauffeur, saying, "You send me Mohamed whenever I ask for him, and here is the car," and a chauffeured limousine, which my father didn't accept, incidentally, and sent it back. But I had all these stories. He came from a wealthy family in the Delta. They were landowners, but he was a half brother to his other brothers, and he ran away from them. They didn't. I think they treated him badly or something. He ran away. He left his hometown and came to Cairo and assumed another name. Muhammad Shita was not his real name. He called himself Shita after another family in his village also, in order as a way of disguising his identity. And later on, when he became a very successful businessman, he spent some time in Turkey, made a lot of money, came back to Egypt, and later on he made it up with his brothers and sisters. But there were very funny stories there, because right after the war, he bought from the British Army, I think something, if I'm not mistaken, it's all in the book, but about 1 million shoes or something. And you know, he bought them for an incredible price, for a very cheap price. And later on, when all these sacks were opened, it was discovered that they were all
left-sided.
Yes, the left shoe and no right shoe. So, you know, he couldn't sell them, he could resell them, he couldn't make any use of them. But he was an intelligent man, and he said there must have been a right shoe for every
left one.
Every left one. And he sort of traced that, and all over the area, the Middle East, because the British were all over the place. They were not just in Egypt. And he finally found them in Lebanon. And he traveled to Lebanon and bought them for an even cheaper price, because the person who bought them in Lebanon didn't know what to do with them and was only very happy to find someone willing to buy them anyway. So he bought them, brought them back to Egypt, put every shoe with its...
and made a fortune.
and made a fortune, yes. That's one of his funny stories, but there were many others.
Well, definitely, I mean, when we look at the genetic pool, as you have said, Salmawy was very much interested in in his land and planting land, and Shetabi was very interested in business.
Yes.
But these traits never reached you, right? More or less. You tried to take care of the land. You didn't go into business, although your father did go into business, and you were never much interested in that. So how come
My
the
father,
genetic pool
yes.
didn't affect you? Because on both sides, both families were interested in business and making
Yes.
effort to get the money through business. So
Well,
what happened?
my paternal grandfather was what you would call landed gentry.
Landlord, yes.
Yes. And he all his life was the land. My father was more like his father-in-law, my mother's father. He was more interested in business. But after his companies were nationalized in the beginning of the 60s, he had nothing left but the land, so he resorted to...
It went to his own profession, which is
cultivating,
an agriculture engineer, because this is how
originally,
he
these
graduated.
were his studies, yes.
Yes.
I was never interested in either, neither business nor... and I think I'm the first one in my family who's interested in, literature, who's more on the intellectual side. My father was a cultured man who read a lot and all that, but as far as career is concerned, he was more in business. I was never interested in business, and neither was I interested in cultivating land as well. All my interest was in intellectual activity.
You had, I think it's a very strange experience. I mean, if I imagine myself in early childhood, when my mother and father would come to me and say, "We are going for a trip for 6 months. Take care of your brother and sister, and we'll see you soon." I think this was a difficult experience. Don't you think so?
For me, yes. I think I was very close to my mother in particular. And it was in 1950, I think.
So you were 5 years old at that
I'm
time.
only 5 years old at the
So
time.
you were conscious of this incident up till now, right?
Yes, and there was a kind of rupture for 6 months. 6 months for a 5-year-old child
It's a very long
is a
period.
lot, yes. And I think it affected me greatly. They went to the States, and
They took an extravagant trip on Queen Elizabeth, right?
Queen Mary.
Queen
They were
Mary,
on
yes.
Queen Mary.
Yes. Elizabeth
And,
was not then queen.
No, but they
Was Elizabeth
they are
first,
twin
Twin
boats.
boats, yes.
Yes. Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, of
Yes.
course, and Queen Elizabeth the first.
The first, yes.
But they were on Queen Mary, and they spent some time there in the States, and my father had a lot of business there and came back with a lot of business as well. But they also went to the Dale Carnegie Institute and did courses there, and they came back with a lot of wealth. I mean, not material wealth,
Yes.
but a lot of moral and
Information.
intellectual wealth, and in the field
Culture,
of
yes.
information and culture, which we used to talk about a lot, and they used to talk about a lot in the family as well.
But you never forgave them for that. Because I can feel it in the sentence. I don't know why my father took her for this trip. Maybe it's something like as if he's paying a debt or something. So to her, I mean, a moral debt. Making up for something. Yes, yes. So this means that you didn't forgive them, right?
Well, no, I don't think you don't forgive. But if something affects you, you say it has affected me. You may forgive because it wasn't meant as a hurt.
Yes, of course.
But it's just childhood memories.
Yes. So in such a close relation with your mother, I believe she was very much into art. And I believe this is where you got your genes of loving paintings, for tasting paintings, and of course the loving of photography, and definitely in the end you got married to a very famous dear lady and artist. That's of course Madame Nazli. Of course she is a painter, and your mother was a painter as well. So how far this affected you on the cultural level, the love of art and the love of photography really attracted your attention to cinema and art, as you have said?
Well, they say that people marry the girls who resemble their mothers.
Yes, I heard that.
But strangely, when I married Nazli, who later became the famous artist Nazli Madkour,
Of course.
she was not yet an artist.
Really?
She had graduated from the Faculty of Economics and Political Science. Yes, she was artistic and used to, do little paintings every now and then, but she hadn't turned into a professional artist yet. She became so later on. And my mother also was not a professional artist.
Yes.
She painted a lot.
But the quality of the paintings are beautiful. The ones that you have put on your book is really are very
I have
professional,
some of them,
level of very professional
at
level.
home. Yes, I keep them at home as a souvenir of my mother.
And
Very
she loved the
nice
Impressionism
ones.
for some time.
Yes.
I believe this is very interesting.
But I think, as you pointed out, it was due to her that I perceived and became sensitive to art and beauty and all these things. I think without her in my life, I may not have been the writer that I became.
Definitely. So this will take us to the school, Victoria College. I mean, it's a very strange love-hate relation. I mean, you went to the school in its epic years, the years before 1956, where the school was a very well-established school then in Maadi. And even your dad used to say, I've sent my children to the best schools in town.
Yes, he used to boast in front of his friends.
Yes, to brag about it.
And I wasn't very happy about it because
Yes.
I didn't like school at the
You
time.
didn't like school, and this is very strange because, I mean, I always have found that people who are interested in literature were not happy in Victoria College. For example, Edward Said, in what he has in his memoirs, when he wrote about Victoria College, the same college that you went to in Maadi, he suffered a lot over there, especially from the bullying from a gentleman by the name of Sarkis Shalhoub, or later on known as our Sharif, who bullied him and his friend.
Yes.
And yet, I think, but by time, this love-hate relationship, or this hate relationship, has changed a bit to a love
Yes,
relationship.
at the beginning, I felt different. Young boys at a certain age are only interested in sports. I wasn't interested in sports at the time, so I felt different, and there wasn't, the equivalent of sports. Of course, there was a library at school. There were a lot of hobbies. We used to do pottery and things like that. But later on, we had a broadcasting service in Victoria College, and I became in charge of the broadcasting. So it was more in my line, and I used to put music. I was in love with music. And I used to put some intellectual and cultural items also. So I think it's the broadcasting that made it up between me and the school. And there was no longer this animosity that I felt towards the school when I was young.
But the animosity remained between Victoria College and the English school, right?
Yes, yeah.
Because I'm a graduate of the English school in Cairo, and we felt this animosities in all the times we had with you, sort of.
We used to feel very jealous
Yes.
of the English school because our school was more expensive. Our school had all, the big names of the sons of kings, Arab kings and princes, and
King
all
Hussein,
that.
yes, of course.
And at the same time, the English school had what we didn't have.
Yes, the
And
best
what
thing in the
we
world.
would have, yes, we would have sacrificed anything to have what the English school has, which is girls.
Yes,
We
yes.
didn't have girls.
We're very proud up till now by this fact, and actually, we are still very good friends. Always, we do a class reunion every time, and always having girls in our life was a very nice idea.
We were the more British school.
Yes.
British prefer boys' schools
Yes.
rather than mixed schools. Strangely enough, when the school was nationalized,
It opened its gates for girls.
yes, so while it was English, we were only boys. And when it became Egyptian, it became more liberal.
That's
And the
very
girls were
interesting.
admitted.
I mean, you have written a very interesting story about a gentleman by the name of Mansour Hassan, who later on became a minister and a graduate of Victoria College from a different perspective. And I believe that this story deserves to be heard by our listeners because it gives you an idea of how people really can appear as with different mottos in life and different perspective of their life, and how this affects them even in such a young age. Could you tell us the story?
Well, Mansour Hassan was the head boy. And it was at a time when we were in Egypt was having a lot of tension in its relations with Britain.
Yes.
And Nasser was about to nationalize the Suez Canal. And there was a very, there was a feeling of nationalism in the air. And Mansour Hassan used to stand up to the British headmaster and the British teachers. And he became a kind of hero to the students. And there was one time when he wanted to challenge the headmaster and to insist on praying.
The noon prayers, yes.
Yes, at the time when the noon prayer should be. And the headmaster, Elliot Smith, wouldn't hear of that. Said, you pray when you go home. And Mansour Hassan explained to him that in Islam you don't pray at the end of the day. You have 5 set hours to pray. And when the noon prayer time comes, I'm going to do my prayer. So he used to leave class and go out. So Elliot Smith dismissed him from school. And Mansour Hassan went to court. And the court, stood by him, said, yes, the students have the right to practice their religion the way it is practiced. But Elliot Smith wouldn't hear of that and wouldn't have an Egyptian court tell him who to accept in his school and who not to accept. But I think the British embassy interfered and there was a lot of tension, and they said we didn't want the situation to deteriorate further and this is a court ruling, so you have to accept it. So he accepted that Mansour Hassan returns to Victoria College but goes to the Alexandria branch and never comes to Maadi as he was. So later on, of course, Mansour Hassan became a very prominent minister.
And before that, he was an important businessman as well, right? He was successful.
He was a very successful businessman, and then turned to politics and held 3 portfolios under Sadat.
Yes.
He was Minister of Culture, Minister of Information, and Minister of Presidential Affairs. And he was the strongest man
around Sadat, yes.
In the cabinet, yes.
This is very interesting.
Later on, after the what is known as the Arab Spring, he was a presidential candidate for some time, but then decided to pull out.
Run,
yes.
That's very interesting, sir. We can go on forever, but I think we have to.
So these are the kind of people we had in Victoria College.
But we had
Who
girls.
Did you have in?
We had girls.
You had
ones.
girls.
Beautiful ones. So
we envied you. Yes.
Well, it's a very, very well deserved envy, if I may use the expression. Well, we are here today in this beautiful afternoon in Cairo with Mr. Mohamed Salmawy, the renowned writer and a man of thoughts and ideas. Thank you very much for coming with us. Stay tuned after the break, and we promise to come back.
So back again, word of info, and we have our guest, Mr. Mohamed Salmawy, Secretary General of Asian, African and Latin American Writing Union, and the famous writer, of course, in Aram.
And definitely, we were just listening to a friend of yours who passed away last week, and he's a friend of yours, Mr. Charles Aznavour.
Yes.
So since we by chance have a song of him, we have to talk about this encounter. You knew him quite well even before his visit to Cairo in 2008, right, sir?
Yes, and I invited him when he came to Cairo in 2008. I invited him in my countryside house in Dahshur, and invited a lot of my friends who were fans of him. We were maybe a crowd of 100 people or
Oh, that's
something.
nice.
Yes, they were all very happy to meet him. But he was very happy to be in Dahshur, at the foot of the Dahshur, the Snefru pyramid, and in an area that is full of palm trees. And he wanted to eat some of the dates that were brought down directly from the palm tree. And he even used his camera to take pictures of all the different parts of the scenery there. And I remember he told me, at my age, at the time he was only 84,
Yes.
but he said, at my age, this camera is my memory. My memory may fail, but this camera will keep the memory for me.
He was such an interesting man, and an Armenian, and his family were stayed in Paris just to give birth for the mother instead of going to the United States of America. And with this great success story, and I mean the insistence and the persistence of fulfilling his art mission until the last minute is definitely something to really respect.
Yes, he was an exceptional man, and he had a lot of links with the Arab world, actually, because his daughter, Katia, was married to an Algerian, and still is married to an Algerian gentleman, and his son, Nicolas, I think, was married to his wife is half Moroccan and half Tahiti or something like that.
That's an interesting combination.
Yes, and he knows the Arab world quite well and has traveled extensively in the area.
So this is really very interesting to talk about that, but definitely after the break we have to talk about your encounter with Al Ahram, because definitely this has been a great part of your life, sir, we want to share with our listeners. So
Back again, word of info, and you can call us at 2578-9407. So back again, word of info with Mr. Mohamed Salmawy, Secretary General of Asian, African and Latin American Writing Union, and our famous writer.
So I think Al Ahram for you, sir, was going also hand in hand with working in the broadcasting service of Radio Cairo. And you went to Al Ahram when you were teaching in the university, and you had a protege, the famous Dr. Rashad Rushdie, who you were very considering to be one of your mentors. And he was should not disappoint, we shouldn't say angry, when you said that you're going to leave the university where you were working as a tutor, and a good tutor of English, and in your career to become a professor in the university, in the Faculty of Arts, yet you decided that you are going to Al Ahram. And he said you want to work as a Sahafi.
Sahafi,
yes. And he didn't like, although his nephew was a famous and well-known Ahmed Bahgat.
Yes.
Yes. So why did you make this move, going to be a journalist, leaving the university, and how was this going hand in hand with working in this radio station in the 60s as well?
Actually, I started working on Radio Cairo when I was a student at the university. I had one or two regular programs that I used to present, and it was a nice hobby, and it remained with me throughout my 4 years of teaching at the university, and a little into my Ahram years, until, of course, journalism takes you away from everything, and it was then that I stopped. But the reason I moved to Al Ahram was because of Muhammad Hassanin Heikel, whom I had met, and he had asked me to join Al Ahram. I hadn't thought previously of becoming a journalist, but I wanted very much to sort of become part of Egyptian life as it really is. And I felt if I continued my life teaching English literature at the university, I was afraid I would I would
Isolated?
live a little isolated, living more in a bubble or anything of the sort. And Al Ahram was really, of course, very close to reality, Egyptian reality at the time. And I thought it was, it responded to what I wanted for my life. And I wasn't mistaken. It opened a very large vista in front of my life, and horizons, new horizons. And I think it's a move that I have not regretted, even though I enjoyed very much teaching, and I enjoyed and still enjoy English literature. But this move in terms of my career, I think, was a right decision.
But I mean, this was perhaps the strangest interview that Mr. Hassan Haikal had in his life, right? When he told him, I want to test the Ahram to see if I'm going to like the job or not.
Well,
and he was stunned, you know.
You're speaking like Mr. Haikal now. I didn't say I wanted to test Al-Ahram, but I said yes. Well, that's what he told me.
The story.
That's what he told me. Yes, but I told him that I hadn't worked as a journalist before, and would he allow me to, take a full schedule for 1 month, and at the end of this month I would tell him whether I could do the job or not. And he said exactly what you just told me now. He said, you want to put Al-Ahram to the test, which is something he wouldn't hear of course.
Yes, of course.
But I told him, no, well, consider it to be, a two-sided
it's
test.
like an engagement, you know.
Yes, you have to test me as well. So I may not be fit for the job. But after 1 month, I went back to him and I said, okay, I've decided to join Al-Ahram. So he said, I'm very glad that Al-Ahram has passed the exam.
but he was thinking of making a department for the external affairs or the foreign affairs, and I believe he had the right choice. I mean, you spoke 2 languages fluently and you're very highly cultured, so he was handpicking people to help in this department, right? Or in the whole Ahram.
Nobody was appointed in Al-Ahram, whether he was a head of a department or an elevator boy or whatever, unless he was personally interviewed by Mr. Haikal.
Really?
Yes. He would have people recommend and interview and all that, but at the end, before he signs, he has to be seen by the big boss. So he handpicked everybody, not just me actually, but that was his way of choosing his own staff and the people who worked in Al-Ahram, and he made sure that he had the best that the Egyptian society could offer.
That's really very interesting, because working in Ahram has opened the door for you to read the continuous tickers that are coming. I mean, the only source of information coming from all the different press agencies, and you can first-hand read the journals. Yes, at that
time there was no internet and no...
and you're reading the journals and the magazines and everything, especially you have the languages, both languages or 3 languages, so you were able to read French and American or English journals and newspapers. This was always put at the tips of your fingers. How much this affected you and your life in the 60s in Cairo?
I think it affected me a lot, and I felt I was up to it. And there was a time when I had only spent a year in Al-Ahram, and I walked into Mr. Haikal's office and said I wanted to go to the United Nations to cover, and he made fun of me and he said, to do what? Have you ever been to the UN before? And I said no. He said, what do you know about the UN? I have sent already, and he named 5 of the biggest names in Egyptian journalism.
And they have their own journalists over there. I mean,
and each one has his own agenda. He'll follow one or the other of the topics that will be discussed during the plenary sessions and in the Security Council. And I said, I'm going to follow something that you have not mentioned. So he was taken back, that he had missed on something. And I said, the new Secretary General, Youthant, had just finished his term. He was not going to renew. There were a number of candidates. There was a lot of competition and a lot of, speculation and things. And I had done my homework, and I think I impressed him by showing that I knew my subject, I knew what I was talking about. And that is when he agreed that I could leave. And actually, when I say I was trying to be up to it, up to the challenge, I managed at the end of my visit in New York to have the first interview in the world with the new Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim. Yes. And it was published in Al-Ahram.
And you met the other candidate as well, and the other candidate told you, I'm going to lose it, right? And this
yes.
was a more or less secret maneuver, nobody knew about it, right?
I preferred the other candidate, Max Jacobson, who was Finnish and who was a stronger personality, whereas Waldheim was more, the tiptoe kind of diplomacy of the 19th century. But Waldheim, Jacobson reminded me of Dag Hammarskjöld and that kind of caliber. But he told me that he was not going to win, as he had just learnt. And he told me it's because of the Arabs. And I said, how come? He said, the Soviets are going to veto me because they said they will do that because of their Arab friends who do not want me to become Secretary General because I have some Jewish ancestry. And I hadn't heard anything of the sort, so I went to our Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Mahmoud Riyad,
yes.
who was, Zayat was the ambassador.
Ambassador, yes.
But Mahmoud Riyad was the Minister of Foreign Affairs who was attending the UN, and I told him about it, and he said, nonsense. I personally do not know that he has Jewish ancestry, and even if he does, and we never told the Soviets that we want them to veto. And I pursued the subject and found out that the Soviets didn't like Jacobson.
Because he was Finnish, right?
Yes, and
Definitely.
They considered him anti-Soviet, and he had written a book about the Russian-Finnish war, and they considered it to be anti. And so I went to Jacobson and I told him what I had found out. I said, the Arabs have nothing to do with it. You have a problem with the Soviets. And he was very impressed by that. And I was surprised to find that later on, when he wrote his memoirs, which were entitled, yes, I think it was entitled The 38th Floor. That's the floor where the office of the Secretary General is located. He mentioned the story. And he said it was the Egyptian journalist Mohamed Salmawy who found out that this was not true and related all the details.
That's very interesting, because I always knew, that Finland was the best thing about Finland is that it was never a victim of its geography. The presence of Finland in this area in between Soviet Union and the northern part of the hemisphere made it able to stand two invasions, the German Nazis and the Soviets in the war. That's why both countries and both powers are not feeling happy with them. So this is really very interesting. So you came back with two of the most important interviews, and I think this was very impressive to Mr. Haeckel at that time. But days were running and rushing towards the 1973 war and the raft, of course, between President Sadat and Haeckel. How was Al-Ahram after this raft?
Well, it was in great confusion because Sadat didn't like Al-Ahram much, and even less its editor-in-chief, Haeckel, and there was a total rupture between them. But I personally, apart from Haeckel, I wasn't very happy with what was happening during the first years of Sadat's rule, where the situation was very volatile. He wasn't doing much. He was promising every year that he wouldn't let the situation, the no war, no peace situation, drag on. But then the end of the year came and he did nothing. There were a lot of university demonstrations by university students and all that. And I had signed a petition written by Tawfiq al-Hakim, our greatest writer, criticizing that situation and asking for more freedom of speech and for the release of the university students who were under arrest and all that. And Sadat decided to fire us all. 104 writers and journalists were all fired, including myself. And then right before the 73 war, in fact 1 week before the war, he decided to pardon us and to say that we can go back to work. And I didn't like that. I said I didn't like his firing me, and I didn't like his
Reinstallment.
you know, just like that. You felt like a piece on a chessboard or something. So I said, no, I'm not going. And they would call me from Al-Aram every day and say, aren't you coming back? You have been pardoned. And he's pardoned for what? For expressing my opinion? But then all of a sudden, the 73 war happened. I heard the news on the radio. I saw what was happening. And I felt I had to be there in my office when a thing like this was happening. And in a few hours, I was on my desk, receiving the tickers and carrying out the job I was supposed to do on the foreign desk and all that. And I never thought again of whether I wanted to be back or not, or whether I liked Sadat's decision or not.
A lot of water has passed under the bridge after the 1973 war, and comes the 19th of January 1977, which was, I think, a very crucial moment for President Sadat, and a very crucial moment as well for Mr. Mohamed Salmawy. It's the most important chapter, if we may say, in the book, because I think there are more interesting chapters afterwards in the second part of the book, which we are looking forward to read. And also the most important thing is it was a very crucial moment for you on the personal level, because you were sent to jail. Right?
That's right. Yes. The country was in turmoil. I mean, if during the early 70s university students were demonstrating, in 77 it was the whole country that was demonstrating, from Alexandria down to Aswan. And the authorities thought this would be a good time to sort of round up some of the critical voices in the press and in the media. So I was arrested and accused of leading the demonstrations. Yes. It was very flattering, of course, to know that I led the demonstrations throughout Egypt, from Alexandria to Aswan.
You were at home on that day in particular.
Yes, doing it by remote control, you know. Or that my writings, was the thing that flared up the whole thing. But of course all this was not true. But I was arrested for a while, until the court found there was no cause, no real accusation there, and I was released. It said immediate release without bail, which means there wasn't the shadow of a doubt.
The period of jail was very interesting because you have met a lot of people who became later on friends and colleagues, and also it's an interesting period because it was a sort of self-criticism, of course, and you have discussed it, especially in the notebook that you had the chance and the permission to write.
Yes.
From the jail authorities, that you could write some of your memoirs and what you're writing.
Yes, I was keeping a diary in prison, which
was regularly checked.
Yes, it was regularly checked, and sometimes I had to write things in codes and symbols, which unfortunately, when the time came for me to write,
you forgot how to decipher them.
Right? I didn't know what they meant, and I had to go back to some of my colleagues who were with me in jail and ask them about certain things, because they were encoded in a way that was, about 40 years ago, so I almost forgot. But it served me very well, this diary, when I was writing this book. You didn't tell me what you would call this book in English.
Yes. The book's name is يوما أو بعض يوم.
I would call it, I wouldn't let you make the mistake of calling it a day or part of a day. I call it a day or just about.
Or just about, yes.
But it is a verse from the Quran, of course, which says that our life, once it is finished, it is no more than a day, or even, or just about.
Yes.
It's not even a full
This is
day.
very interesting because 2 years after your release from jail, almost 3 years, you found yourself in a trip visiting your sister and your brother-in-law when he was an ambassador in Australia, and suddenly
In New Zealand.
in New Zealand, I'm sorry, and suddenly there was the 5th of September again,
Yes.
and everybody was being arrested, has been arrested, especially some of your colleagues from the first from the first case.
Yes.
And you made the decision that you're going to come back.
Yes, because, well, it was a very strange incident. I had an interview before going to New Zealand to my sister. I was in Australia to have an interview
With
with
the Prime Minister.
the Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser. And as I went in to meet the Prime Minister, he told me, "What is it that is happening in Egypt?" And I said, "What? I haven't heard." He said, "All these arrests, thousands of people have been arrested and all that." And I said, "But I hadn't seen anything in the press." And he said, "You know, the difference of time didn't allow the press to publish it, but he was told by his embassy in Cairo about the incident, and he was told that my name featured on the lists that were published in the morning papers on that day." So when he told me that, you can imagine what state I was in. And I told him, "Well, in this case, please allow me to take my leave, because I will not be able to publish your interview anyway. So let me not make you lose your time with me." He had elections at the time, and he had given me 45 minutes, so I didn't want him to waste more time. But he said, no, stay on. I would like to ask you about what is happening in Egypt. Why do you think this happened, and why are people against Sadat's policy, and what about the Muslim Brotherhood? How strong are they? He kept asking me a lot of things, and I would answer. And I spent the 45 minutes
Being interviewed.
being interviewed by the Prime Minister rather than the other way around. But the following day, I had a guide from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Canberra who was accompanying me on my visit. And he told me that the Prime Minister was very impressed by his meeting with me, and that he thanked me for the conversation that we had. And he said he asked me to give you this message. The laws governing political asylum in Australia are very stringent. But if you do feel that you need to ask for asylum, the Prime Minister promises that he will help you with that.
That's really very touchy. And I think this helped you more to make the decision of coming back, right?
Well, the first thing it did is that it brought tears to my eyes to feel that I was welcomed by a country at the very end of the world, down under, as they say, with whom I had no relations at all, and that the Prime Minister in this country, offers help, while the leadership in my country puts me in jail or whatever. The situation was very
Confusing.
Yes, and it brought tears to my eyes, and I spent a very bad night. But the following morning, I had decided to go back to Egypt, whatever happens, and I wouldn't accept a life of, self-imposed exile, which I don't know when it will end. Fortunately, it ended only 1 week later, because by the time I came back, Sadat had been unfortunately
assassinated.
Assassinated in the manner we saw, and the whole life changed, and all the people in prison were released, and a new phase of Egypt's history started, which will be
in the
subject of the second part of the of my memoirs, which hasn't come out yet.
Sir, we really enjoyed the talk with you today, because definitely we have enjoyed it very much, and we want you to make us a promise that please come back again to us, not just before writing the book, not after writing the book, but also to another episode of World of Info, to have more info and more emphasis on this beautiful book.
Well, it was a great pleasure, and I would be quite happy to come any other time. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure, sir.
Thank you. And by this we come to the end of Word of Info with Mr. Mohamed Salmawy, renowned writer and Secretary General of Asian, African and Latin American Writing Union, and Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University. Dua Mohamed was at the controls. I'm Najla Naguib. See you next Thursday. Same time, same station, FM 95.4.